What is the state of the black economy in 2023? Why do black people have less than 1/10 the wealth of white people? How did we get here? We'll answer those questions today with factual data and sound arguments explaining why the black economy is possibly the worst it's ever been. We're going to look into the data and prove in a concise way how discrimination has blocked black Americans from building wealth. Get ready to get wrecked by this data. I'm about to shred every person who says black people just don't work hard enough. Real quick, make sure you hit that like button one time for the algorithm and subscribe to get your face smacked with data. Or maybe you want the data so you can shred other ignorant people. Anyways, hit the subscribe. This is meant to be somewhat of a pillar video for this channel, presenting the long history of discrimination against black people in America. I plan to do videos expanding on some of these things in the future, but wanted to start off with the here's where we're at now video. Let's get into it. Just to be sure we're on the same page, first let's define wealth. What is wealth? Wealth measures the value of all assets of worth owned by a person, community, company, or country. Wealth is determined by taking the total market value of all physical and intangible assets owned, then subtracting all debts, as defined by Investopedia. The Brookings Institution is a nonprofit public policy organization based in Washington, D.C. that conducts in-depth research to solve societal problems. They have closely examined the data and present a more comprehensible definition of wealth. Here's their definition. Wealth is the sum of resources available to a household at a point in time. As such, it is clearly influenced by the income of the household, but the two are not perfectly correlated. Two households can have the same income, but the household with fewer expenses or with more accumulated wealth from past income or inheritances will have more wealth. Let's take a look at where we stand economically by looking at a few sources like Harvard and the census. Income is unequal, but wealth is even more unequal, said Alexandra Kilowald, Harvard professor of sociology in the Faculty of Art and Sciences, who studies inequality in the contemporary United States. You can think of income as water flowing into your bathtub, whereas wealth is like the water that's sitting in the bathtub. Wealth is a safety net that keeps a life from being derailed by temporary setbacks and the loss of income. The safety net allows people to take career risks knowing that they will have a buffer when success is not immediately achieved. Family wealth allows people, especially young adults who have recently entered the labor force, to access housing in safe neighborhoods with good schools, thereby enhancing the prospects of their own children. Wealth affords people opportunities to be entrepreneurs and inventors, and the income from wealth is taxed at much lower rates than income from work, which means that wealth creates more wealth. In 2016, the median wealth of white households was $171,000. That's 10 times the wealth of black households, $17,100, a larger gap than in 2007. Among lower and middle income households, white families have 4 times as much wealth as black families. To some degree, this reflects differences in home ownership rates among families, 49% for lower income whites versus 31% for lower income blacks. As of 2019, non-Hispanic white householders had a median household wealth of $187,300 compared with $14,100 for black householders. Asian householders had a median household wealth of $206,400, which is not statistically different from the estimate for non-Hispanic white householders. This just means their median wealth is equivalent to that of white households, but they make up a smaller percentage of the population. Of course, the larger population share of white households leads them to contribute more to inequality growth, even in the counterfactual or baseline. But the increase is driven disproportionately by this group in the true data. That means even when accounting for percentages of the population, the wealth of white households is increased disproportionately when compared to that of black households. Kilowald also said this of wealth: if you have wealth, it can protect you if you lose your job or your house. Wealth is distinctive because it can be used as a cushion, and it can be directly passed down across generations, providing families more choices and greater opportunity in the present and the future. Breaking down the impact of chattel slavery is outside the scope of this video, but must be mentioned because this is part of the multi-generational damage that has been inflicted on Black Americans. I will look to a few sources in an attempt to concisely explain hundreds of years of slavery up to the 1960s. After the end of slavery and the failed Reconstruction, Jim Crow laws, which existed till the late 1960s, virtually ensured that Black Americans in the South would not be able to accumulate or pass on wealth. And through the Great Migration and after, African Americans faced employment, housing, and educational discrimination across the country. Muhammad, who was also the Suzanne Young Murray Professor at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, said, quote, "The two dominant non-European populations, indigenous and Africans, were subjected to various coercive forms of labor that would be distinct from the experience of indentured European servants. And as such, racism became an economic imperative to harness land and labor for the purpose of wealth creation, and that did not change in any substantial way until really about the 1960s. The article goes on to say, in fact, the founders discovered the issues of Black slavery and equality were so divisive that they opted to kick the can down the road, hoping some future generation would prove wiser or better. Most scholars agree that the legacy of slavery and other subsequent forms of legal discrimination against African Americans has hindered their ability to accumulate wealth. Today's African American adults and children are living with the legacy of discrimination, inequality, and exclusion from slavery to redlining and other discriminatory practices, said Kilowald. And in turn, white Americans are benefiting from legacies of advantage. We're going to break down the main 3 reasons for the large wealth gap. While there is more nuance and likely more discrimination that contribute to this inequality, we can systemically and economically point to 3 factors: home ownership, income inequality, inheritance. Each of these can and likely will become their own video, but for our purposes today, I'll cover each of these topics as succinctly as possible. I will also note that these are largely factors existing from the 1960s to the present day. So while much of it is rooted in slavery and influenced by slavery, it is blatantly perpetuated by government policy and white supremacist complicitors. After World War II, many white veterans were able to take advantage of programs like the GI Bill to buy homes, the largest asset held by most American families, with low interest loans. But lenders often unfairly turn down Black applicants, shutting those vets out of the benefit. I'll quickly give you a definition because it's going to come up multiple times, and I want to make sure you recognize redlining. Here's the Cornell Law School definition of redlining. Typically, the systemic denial of loans or insurance in predominantly minority areas held down property values and hampered African American families' ability to live where they chose. The U.S. Department of Treasury has a series of studies exploring the racial differences in economic security, with housing as one area of emphasis. It goes on to read, "The benefits from home ownership have not been shared equally. In the second quarter of 2022, the home ownership rate for white households was 75% compared to 45% for black households. Like the overall racial wealth gaps, these gaps in home ownership rates have changed little over the last 3 decades. In fact, the black-white gap in home ownership rates was the same in 2020 as it was in 1970, just 2 years after the passage of the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which sought to end racial discrimination in the housing market. The disparities in home ownership rates are attributable to many factors. For one, past government policies supported white home ownership while excluding many black households from similar benefits. As an example, there is evidence that the Federal Housing Administration rarely insured loans in low-income, urban neighborhoods where most black Americans lived in the 1930s. This exclusionary behavior prevented many black households from owning homes and likely contributes to the persistence of racial home ownership gaps today, given the positive association between parental and child home ownership. Also to blame is past and current discrimination in the private mortgage market, historically in the form of withholding mortgage services in redlined neighborhoods, and more recently in the form of an increased likelihood of mortgage rejection and higher offered mortgage rates and fees for minority buyers. Leading up to the crisis of the mid-2000s, black mortgage applicants were more likely than similarly qualified white households to be rejected or to receive worse terms even after their proxies for credit history and wealth were taken into account. Finally, continued gaps in home ownership can be partially attributed to stark differences in other indicators of economic well-being, such as inheritances, family income, and education. For instance, Black and Hispanic households get less down payment assistance from relatives, a result of receiving markedly less intergenerational inheritances and gifts than white Americans. That further underscores the long-lasting benefits of wealth accumulation for households and the harms of its absence. In addition to racial disparities in home ownership rates, there are also significant differences in home values and housing returns, defined as the difference between what the home is sold for and the all-in cost of buying and owning the home. Research suggests that the ratio of the average white household's home value to the average black household's home value today is 2.5, the same as it was in 1970. And that housing returns are 3.7 percentage points lower for black homeowners than for white homeowners. Racial differences in rates of distressed home sales also contribute to racial differences in housing wealth in the racial wealth gap. Distressed home sales tend to generate substantial wealth loss because most mortgage defaults occur among homeowners with positive home equity, and most homes sold in foreclosure are at a considerable discount. Therefore, groups that are more likely to experience distressed sales have the potential to be disproportionately harmed, and over the last 3 decades, rates of foreclosure have consistently been higher for black than for white households. They conclude by saying owning a home continues to be the primary source of wealth for most Americans, and efforts must be made to extend the benefits of home ownership to people who have long been shut out of the market, including discrimination in the mortgage market, disparities in down payment assistance, and appraisal bias. Remember, this was published in November of 2022. The National Association of Realtors also published a study in 2022 looking into racial disparities in home ownership. The pandemic, rising home prices, and low housing supply have disproportionately impacted Black households more than any other race or ethnic group. According to this report, white households are 40% more likely to be able to afford to buy a home compared to Black households. So due to lower income, affordability for Black households is the lowest compared to any other race. They include many other factors like education and mortgage denial rate, which incorporate that nuance I spoke about earlier. Many of these things are interconnected and work with each other. For the purposes of this video, we're going to explain it by referring to this New York Times article, "Discrimination Seeps into Every Aspect of Home Buying for Black Americans," published in November of 2022. The article reads, "Racism and discrimination baked into the federal government's housing policy for decades via redlining, inequitable division of resources, and the disparate distribution of federal funds and grants dating back to the Jim Crow era have put Black people at a disadvantage," the report notes. It persists today in appraisal bias, fees on homeowner assistance, and even the way in which student loan debt is calculated in loan applications, and remain insurmountable until the policies themselves are fully unraveled, said Jim Carr, the report's co-author, a housing, finance, and urban policy expert. Quote, "Blacks are making progress in slowly obtaining home ownership, but the barriers are substantial and so multifaceted that they are never going to come anywhere near closing the gap unless the federal government takes action that repairs the damage which the federal government did." I'll again look to a few sources to concisely explain the income differences between Black and white households. The Economic Policy Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank created to include the needs of low and middle income workers in economic policy discussions. They found in 2019, the median Black household earned just 61 cents for every dollar of income the median white household earned. The Peter G. Peterson Foundation found that in 2021, households whose head was classified as Asian or white had median incomes that were higher than the national median, while households headed by people classified as Black or Hispanic had median incomes that were lower than the national median. Quick note, I don't like when they combine the Black and Hispanic statistics because the history is much different between the two races. Also, they separated the Hispanic question to include white Hispanics as well, which convolutes the data. Let's get back to it. One reason wealth disparities may persist is due to differences in initial wealth, income, and savings rates. Listen to this line and recall the quick note I just made. A long history of discrimination has left Black and Hispanic households with substantially less wealth, even in the beginning of our sample period. Blacks and Hispanics' history of discrimination are far different in experience and length of time. But let's get back to the study. Moreover, Black and Hispanic households earn considerably less than white households, limiting their ability to save and build wealth. Here's a quote. The extraordinary income inequality in the United States diminishes opportunities for low-income families and for children of color, said Murnane, Juliana W. and William Foss Thompson, research professor of education and society of the Graduate School of Education. Again, the children of color combines Black and Hispanic households unnecessarily. While I don't doubt Hispanic people face much discrimination, discrimination towards Black people is distinctly different and should be regarded as a separate group when possible. Economists Claudia Golden, Henry Lee, professor of economics, and Lauren Katz, Elizabeth Allison, professor of economics, believe that the solution to reducing income inequality is strongly tied to the wealth gap, is to close the educational divide. Inequality began to grow in the 1980s as the economy started to shift towards knowledge-based industries and the supply of highly trained workers fell below demand. You could wipe out a large fraction of inequality by ramping up the education of individuals who are limited in their access and finish a college education, said Golden. The problem of wealth inequality is more extreme than income inequality, since the former builds on the latter, and their effects persist across generations. The legacies of the Jim Crow era and racism against Blacks are expressed today in residential segregation, housing discrimination, and discrimination in the labor market, said Katz. A study by Suarez and Thompson conducted in 2019 found that income differences do explain a part of the racial wealth gap, though a substantial gap exists even after conditional earnings. Wealth gaps may also persist across generations, as young Black households are less likely to receive intergenerational transfers from their parents. This is going to be a pretty short section because the data is relatively easy to show and doesn't require much additional explanation. The University of Pennsylvania Wharton analyzed the disparity inheritances across the income distribution to evaluate disparities by race and age in the Survey of Consumer Finances. Inherited wealth accounts for as much as 20 to 50% of total household wealth. Therefore, disparities of inheritances by race reflect the racial wealth gap documented extensively in recent research. They estimate that white households inherit over 5.3 times as much as Black households. Also, white households are 2.8 times more likely than Black households to inherit any wealth. Across all age groups, white households on average inherit about $15,000, about 5 times more than Black families. Out of households under 35 receiving inheritances, the median of average inheritance across surveys for Black households is $49,000. This is 55% of what white households in that age group inherit, $89,500. On the other hand, white households ages 55 through 74 inherit an average of $211,300 when they do inherit, nearly 4.9 times the average inheritance of $43,600 that Black households in the same age groups receive when they do receive one. That's right. When a white person does get an inheritance, the average person under 35 receives $89,000, and between the ages of 55 to 74 receives $211,000. If the black person does receive an inheritance, almost 3 times less likely, the average black person under 35 receives $49,000, and between the ages of 55 to 74 receives $43,000. This shows the clear increase in wealth as white people get older, as opposed to a decrease in wealth for black people as they age. This also correlates with the wealth data from the beginning of the video. To conclude, and just to wrap up this video, black people have been blocked from building wealth and all of those opportunities since slavery, and even more since the 1960s. Blocked from home ownership through mortgage loan denials, veteran GI Bill denials, redlining, just to name a few, which also still continues to this day. Blocked from higher income jobs due to less opportunities from finding those jobs and limited educational opportunities. Blocked from multi-generational wealth, being less likely to receive an inheritance because the older black generations weren't allowed to build wealth, both through policy and the other two aforementioned reasons. Anyone who says black people just don't work hard enough or bitches about the hip hop hurting our culture is just ignorant. This is the data. These are the facts. If you feel any other way, you're justifying white supremacy and you're racist. Period. Don't at me. Again, like the video, hit the subscribe, support the channel. I have several videos in the works looking through the factual data for different things I find interesting and just things I want to point out. So make sure you hit the subscribe so you can tune in. I'm out.